209. So all those things basically we see, although there are other many achievements you have, and obviously we have no words to express our gratitude and express our satisfaction to you, particularly accepting our request and presenting your experiences and knowledge and practices whatever you have done today to the audience. The audience is versatile in nature, in the sense they are from different disciplines, different parts of the country, particularly from India, as well as from abroad also. And CoE-SEA, the Center of Excellence in Safety Engineering Analytics, it was established in IIT Kharagpur with a noble purpose that we want to save people at work. If we can save people at work, at roads, at any at large in societies, our satisfaction will be immense. And with this noble venture, we started this weekend talk to propagate safety engineering, safety management, safety analytics, safety science to the entire community, entire nations, and for the abroad. And with this, I once again thank you, and I welcome you, Professor Kukulman, to present your lecture, present your expert talk today. In fact, I have no words to praise your that support and that help. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. This is so kind. I look forward to sharing my understanding of pedestrian crashes here, in Texas and the United States with you. And I hope you can see these slides well. I took a picture from India. So I know that the United States situation is different, but it is, ultimately humans moving, and often in heavier, fast vehicles that causes a lot of issues for our health, and not just through crashes, but also through emissions. And that is a very big issue for India, of course. So I've done some research on electric vehicle adoption in India, and I've been to Jaipur. And when I landed in Delhi, I could immediately smell, as I left the airplane, the air quality issues. And so a lot of my colleagues do research for Indians, really, really important. And of course, so many people living in India and dying on the roadways or being injured and losing family members. So very, very, very important topic, much more important than congestion, actually. Here in the United States, it's about $1 trillion. So 1/20th of our economy every year is lost in crashes, economic and pain and suffering costs. And I imagine it might be similar for India. And the pedestrian share is rising. So let me tell you a bit more about that. The number of deaths, especially the total pedestrian crashes per vehicle kilometer traveled, is pretty stable over the last 10 or more years, but the death toll has been rising. So big jumps, especially in Texas, where we have population rising. And many of you know that Austin is a very popular city, and it has been growing for many, many decades, actually. And here in Texas, it's almost 20% of the people that die on the public roadways are pedestrians now. And of course, they are a tiny share of that VKT. So they are less than 1% of the person miles traveled, let's say. So they're not even in the vehicles, but of the total person miles traveled, they're less than 1% for sure. And yet they're 20% of the death toll. They're so vulnerable. And yet walking is an incredibly important and really the best mode. Biking also very efficient. So while the crash rate in terms of total pedestrians on this left-hand side is very constant across the top here. Let's see, I'm not able to draw for some reason, so I'll just highlight. And yeah, I think this is just WebEx not interacting so well with my PowerPoint slide. But the death tolls are rising. So this is the image on the right, and I think that may be very similar for India. So our deaths, almost doubled over the past 11 years. And we looked into walking. Maybe people are walking more because they're being asked to walk. So, it's a good mode. We know that it's healthy. We're kind of overweight, and there's a fair amount of obesity and other. And I think India is similar. I was just reading in the New York Times or The Economist some of the obesity and overweight issues. And even though we're very different countries, we unfortunately both suffer from that affliction. So walking is a great way to stay healthy and keep your heart strong and probably lose weight. But we're not doing a lot more of it. So that's not the reason for it. And the pedestrian deaths per person is, rising by almost 50%. So even once you control for population, it is really unfortunate. And of course, the world has a vision zero. Most countries have a vision zero. We'd like to see no more deaths. And the trends are completely opposite to that, especially for pedestrians. So we have a lot of data set here. So Texas is a very big state. It's bigger than most countries, I think, in terms of both population and size. And we have really extensive data sets, fortunately, here. So we're looking at population and jobs locally. So for every segment in this extensive network of roadways where the cars can possibly be, of course, there are lots of pedestrian deaths and accidents off the roadway on private driveways and in parking lots. We have lots of injuries, but those are not in my data set. So we turn to the public data set, which is TxDOT's. So this is the Texas Department of Transportation here, the TxDOT. And they get the data, and they help clean it up and try to find a latitude and a longitude for each crash. So that's millions of crashes over this 10-year period, and about almost 6,000 pedestrian deaths across a very large network. So that's a pretty sparse data set of deaths, and maybe 80,000. So we have about 80,000 centerline miles of roadway that the Texas Department of Transportation is responsible for, and then the cities and the counties are responsible for another 80 or 100,000. And so this is about one pedestrian every 2 miles or every 3 kilometers. And there's lots of important information there. So we do the best we can to find variables. Of course, in the crash record, how severe the injury was, the location, the time of day, the day of week, the road geometry. We can look at from the inventories that the Department of Transportation keeps. That's required by law. So the U.S. Department of Transportation checks all that data every year at the state level. And of course, we know who was involved and the vehicles involved, and sometimes they're big pickup trucks, and sometimes, they're sedans or minivans, and lots of information about the roadway, including the average annual daily traffic and the vehicle miles or kilometers traveled on that road because of the length of the segment and the curvature, the presence of sidewalks and medians, the width of the lanes, the number of lanes, at intersections as well. And we've got good population and job data. So we're trying to get a sense of how many pedestrians might be out there, how many driveways. These all create problems. We also know where the transit stops are. So that's kind of fortunate for us. The public transit agencies provide all that information. We don't have, casual jitney service. It's not allowed here in the United States. So it is kind of a formal database of public transit agencies. Of course, we have annual rainfall, and we have school, hospital positions, and we were able to get sidewalks, especially in the city of Austin, where the University of Texas is. We were able to get great sidewalk data, so that was helpful to many of our models. And this is, if you look closely at Texas, you've got Houston, which is very big, and Dallas and Fort Worth, and then Austin and San Antonio. You've also got El Paso and some other cities that show up. But the big five are the ones I mentioned, and they have about 24% of the population, but 36% of the deaths. So cities have more pedestrians, they have more cars mixing with pedestrians, or in the case of India, you will have three-wheelers and two-wheelers interacting with pedestrians. Dallas has the most pedestrian deaths per capita, but Austin, unfortunately, has the highest percentage share of all its deaths as pedestrians. And this is what a street might look like in the United States. I'm not sure that this is Texas. It looks a little bit more like Arizona to me, and maybe New Mexico. So those are nearby states. And there might be a median, so this pedestrian is trying to get up onto that median and protect himself here in the middle. And look at all these big vehicles that we have. And of course, we have lanes, very different from India. We've got signals. We usually have crosswalks, but they might be far between. So a lot of people will jaywalk and they will cross in the middle of the street. And we have different statistical models to estimate things like that, to predict the number of crash counts, not just total, but also fatal, and the severity, which is an ordered variable that goes from, no injury, which is very unlikely. If the police were called, basically there is an injury to that pedestrian. If the pedestrian walks away, oftentimes they will not call the police, or the police will not log it because it's not worth $1,000 of damage, which is the minimum threshold for reporting a crash here in the United States. But there's about 5 levels of injury severity in most crashes, and so we use ordered probit or a heteroscedastic ordered probit for that. And when we do that, when we predict crash counts and severities, we see that the proximity, the nearness to schools and hospitals, as well as transit stops, are very predictive. All 3 of those, unfortunately, are places of high crash counts for the pedestrian. And we're already controlling for population and jobs density very locally in these positions. And there's, like 100,000 segments. So it's a very big data set over 10 years, 100,000 segments across the state of Texas. And we have these variables everywhere, and they are very predictive. So if we reduce the distance to the school, so we make it closer by 1 standard deviation, we see the pedestrian crash rates per vehicle kilometer traveled increase by 52%, and the fatal crash rate per vehicle kilometer traveled on that segment in that intersection is about 23%. And that's sad because we want to keep those young people safe. Those are children typically. Transit stops, of course, also suggest that there's more pedestrians, and so we get another prediction on top of the jobs and population density numbers, which are helping us get a sense of how many people might be walking in that location. We see that the transit stops almost double the pedestrian crash rates, and 50%. So they're especially sites where there's lots of people maybe jaywalking and crossing mid-block. They're trying to catch a bus, and I bet you see this in India. Of course, the amount of vehicles on the roadway has a strong positive effect. It's almost a 1-to-1, a little bit less than that, maybe a 75% increase with that variable when it doubles. And as you can imagine, as we add more lanes to the road, that adds some complexity. It makes the road wider, harder to cross. So that's going to add some pedestrian crashes and deaths, and the population and jobs densities. We also tried to estimate walk miles or walk kilometers traveled in every location and use a sort of a density of walking distances based on household travel surveys that we had at very fine resolution across the state of Texas. So that was important. But on top of that, the densities were important, and of course the proximity to the schools, the hospitals, and those transit stops. If you want to protect those pedestrians, we'll add a median, a raised median, and that's a place where they can stand and protect themselves in the middle of that roadway, and cut through it if you want, so that people pushing strollers or anything that's rolling can get through without having to step up, but protect them on both sides by a raised median. Shoulders also help. They give the cars more leeway, so the cars can move side to side, and the pedestrians have a place, potentially to stand. Of course, a sidewalk is even better. That's like a raised median on the outsides of the roadway, and those do provide some protection. And this is kind of what the results look like. This is what comes to us out of the statistical software that we're using, or maybe we're just using R or Python tools. So those would be free to use. And we've got lots of predictive variables. We've got goodness of fit statistics for pedestrian crashes and fatal pedestrian crashes. And we also look at not just the statistical significance, which is almost always high because we have very big data sets. We also look at the percentage of change in the crash rates as we increase each of these variables by 1 standard deviation. And that's a fair way to do it, rather than 1% or 1 unit. So 1 standard deviation increase in each of these variables. And that's how we identify the most practically significant variables for protecting pedestrians. And so we've highlighted them here, although, this is an indicator variable, the rural variable, that looks very big too, the 46. So the rural areas have fewer pedestrians. The distances are so long that people are just getting into cars, and there's just relatively few cars around. So rural areas don't have this issue as we talked about earlier. It's really the cities where the pedestrians are suffering the most. The vehicle type, as you can imagine, I really recommend smaller vehicles. Not only are they more efficient, and so they protect our planet and our lungs, but they really protect the pedestrians and the cyclists, and they keep the lines of sight open for everybody. So the pedestrians can see around them better, and of course the drivers behind them can see around them, and that helps protect the pedestrians. But once you do hit a pedestrian, of course, if you're driving a bigger vehicle, you're going to hurt that pedestrian much more. And if that pedestrian is older and male, he's more likely to suffer a severe injury, not because males are weaker, but because they do riskier things typically. And so male drivers, also not a good one to crash with. They tend to hurt their pedestrians more, and the young drivers tend to hurt the pedestrians more because they don't appreciate the value of life, these young drivers. I have a son who's 18, and he has already destroyed, not in very bad crashes, but in sort of minor crashes, he has destroyed 2 of our vehicles. So you could drive them away, or one of them away, but it still was basically totaled out by our insurance company. So we can't get the vehicle back. We have to go get another vehicle, thanks to our 18-year-old son. But our 18-year-old daughter, his twin, has done great. And yeah, he thinks he's a great driver, but really it's clear that he is taking way too many risks. Intoxication is an issue here, and I think less of an issue in India, but still something to keep an eye on. It is a very big predictor of crash counts as well as severity. And nighttime, so overnight, this is 8 o'clock in the evening where you guys are, all the way till 5 in the morning, because of the lack of light and some of the behaviors, tired drivers. It's a very dangerous time. Also, first thing in the morning. So just continuing on from 5 a.m. until 7 in the morning, we see because of the darkness, it's just very hard. And the drivers may be waking up and sort of not fully alert yet. And so they are hitting maybe morning runners. And here they're hitting people who've been out drinking or having a party, and everybody's tired, unfortunately. So those dark conditions and the lack of street lighting, really problematic. Also interesting that most of the deaths are away from the intersections. They are mid-block because the drivers don't expect somebody mid-block. They think that's illegal, right, to jaywalk. So they are not really thinking about a pedestrian there. So lots of problems at those mid-block crossings. And this is just more examples of what we do with these models. This is just a mean and variance. This is a heteroscedastic model, and so it's allowing the epsilon term in the ordered probit model to vary as a function of these variables. So that's what these second pair of columns in both sides are for. So you can read more about that in the papers at my website. There's a paper about machine learning. And so instead of using these sort of classical econometric models, we're using different machine algorithms. And so there's artificial intelligence, and the random forest is really does quite well. So the random forests are also easier to interpret, I think. It's a series of trees basically that have been weighted and brought together, which allows for a lot of flexible prediction. And we also compared machine learning, I guess, practical significance results, which we're showing here, to the classic models, and they're very consistent. But you can see there's big differences, like on the transit stop variable here. The XBART and the gradient-based method did, both picked up on that, but the other 2 models, the random forest and the X gradient boosted version, did not. The distance to the nearest school, they were very consistently negative in this case. So a longer distance away from the school is better if you want to avoid crash counts and severities. But this Y variable is the total pedestrian crashes in this case, so it's not the fatalities. Job and population density, obviously helpful at about 40%. So if we increase the job or population density at a site by 1 standard deviation, So every site in the data set has its job density variable increased by 1 standard deviation. You will see about a 40% increase in total pedestrian crashes on that segment. Same thing with the population density. If you increase the vehicle miles traveled on that segment, all four of these models are suggesting like a 250% increase from a 1 standard deviation increase in VMT. And I'm not sure what a 1 standard deviation increase in VMT might be. It could be more than, the median. So it could be quite a big increase for a lot of these sites. And transit, of course, transit stop, pretty important, except in the standard gradient-based method that did not pick up that variable. So every model is going to perform differently, and this is a nice way to kind of compare them and see, what is a more reliable variable. Transit stops within 100 meters of the centroid of that segment, not as reliable a prediction for these models. And let's see. Other factors, well, I was talking about the vehicle types. So we are buying, unfortunately, even though the world is suffering a climate disaster, we still have vehicle manufacturers allowed to build bigger and bigger vehicles and Americans allowed to buy them. And Americans are not as, thoughtful as people who are in the safety community or in the transportation community or engineers like you and me. So the average American is blissfully ignorant and chooses to be that way. And so they're buying a lot of the crossovers and the sport utilities and vans and these light duty trucks are huge. They are monsters. And so they are dominating the sales of US vehicles. And smartphones, of course, or just phones in general, very distracting, both for the pedestrian and the driver. We have a lot of homeless persons in some of our cities, and they will often walk through traffic very purposefully due to mental health and other issues. And so that is what I see is people crossing without regard to the traffic purposefully, and they make up half of the dead in Austin. So, the poor really are out there on the roadways, and then the poor with mental health issues are almost suicidally dying on our roadways in these cities. We do have some increasing, I think, marijuana use in some states because of the legalization. And I don't really think that is driving this at all. Most people who would choose to do that are typically stay at home. And so it's a much safer drug than alcohol, quite honestly, from what we've seen. But I'd love to hear what you guys think could be causing this increase. We do look at the entire network. We break it up into tiny segments so that they're consistent. And we match our crash records. We also use OpenStreetMap to find the intersections. So you could do that, I think, with the Indian roadways. We're trying to identify the worst places. So not just segments, but corridors. So a series of segments and intersections. It's not easy to do, but when you do it, you might find that 10% or 30 or something percent of your pedestrian crashes on a small piece of the network. And so it allows you to focus on where you might add some investment. And here in the city of Austin, it's clear that the hotspots are very close, if not on this major freeway that goes all the way from Canada in the north to Mexico. It's called Interstate Highway 35, so IH35, and about 28% of our pedestrian deaths are really along that, but Lamar and these other highways are important. And like I said, in the city of Austin, where the data are being collected now, just over 50% are persons experiencing homelessness. Even though they are less than 1% of the population, maybe 1/1000th of the population, they are over half of those who die. And you can zoom in further. Here's the river in Austin. The University of Texas is right here. The state capitol is right here. And this is our downtown. And so these are very popular places for walking. And we've ranked them, which helps, the city and the state kind of zoom in and focus on where they might want to add some investment. This is Interstate 35. We've rotated it. So it's east. We're showing you this north-south in an east-west orientation. But you can see some of the big spots, and that really helps you kind of zoom in and tailor these benefit cost ratios that we can highly recommend. So we're looking at saved crash costs by doing some improvements. And that improvement will stay usually for many years. So we're going to discount that future stream of benefits and compare it to the costs, which are usually upfront by investing in like a median or nice crosswalks and sidewalks. But you also, some of the treatments that we're going to choose delay the motorists. So you can reduce the speed limit, you can add speed enforcement. So just reducing the speed limit won't reduce the speeds that much. I think if you reduce the speed limit by like 10 kilometers per hour, you'll get about a 3 kilometer per hour average speed reduction. And you will delay the motorists oftentimes, but it is worth it in many cases. And so we're summing up over time and any locations that we're doing this for, and coming up with a benefit cost ratio. And the reduction in crashes comes from a crash modification factor, which is 1 minus the crash reduction share. So, and then the costs, like I mentioned, are upfront with the treatment, and then usually a discounted delay cost over time. So here's a particular, this is 6th Street, very popular street. This is the interstate freeway, and then there's a frontage road alongside it. So there's an intersection here at grade. And what I highly recommend, and Austin has really adopted this in the last 4 years, is the leading interval for pedestrians. So I'd be interested if you guys are familiar with that. Basically, the pedestrians are allowed to enter the intersection first in the direction that's being given the green. And so when the signal shifts, so it's a signalized intersection, the pedestrians get to start first. So the drivers see them and wait, rather than the drivers just ignoring them and starting off into their left turns and their right turns, and maybe cutting off the pedestrian, and other cars following that driver, and a pedestrian's trying to get through. The pedestrians get to lead by a second or two. And it's a very inexpensive treatment, but it does delay the motorists a little bit. So it might be a 3-second leading interval for the pedestrian. And, a lot of the vehicles aren't delayed. Some are delayed by as much as 3 seconds, or maybe they missed the downstream green signal. So you have to worry a little bit about progression and synchronization. But it's about a 15% pedestrian crash reduction factor for that intersection, which is great. And it's, pretty low cost, because if you already have a pedestrian signal, which you may not in India, but here in the United States, almost every intersection comes with a pedestrian signal. So there's usually enough technology at the intersection to add this, and the cost can be much less than this. It can be, practically negligible. It's just somebody's time resetting the computer for that site. So this is kind of a high cost, I think, for this treatment. And so it really depends. If you already have the employees working for you and you have the technology, then it's cheap. But if you don't have signals, or you don't have, pedestrian signals to begin with, then that will be, more expensive. And pedestrian signals are really valuable. We also have this value of time, because we're slowing the drivers down. So we have some delay costs in addition to the $17.50, and the delay costs dominate, right? So that $17.50 is nothing compared to this 10-year cost of delays so it's over 10 years, which is kind of like a 20-year with discounted value. So it's just a simple 10-year multiplication, but it's sort of like a 20-year discounted value. And then with a 15% reduction in the collisions at this intersection relating to this issue, we have like a 1.4 million benefits over those same 10 years, just simply using the past crash histories. There might be more crashes in the future if we didn't do this, because of rising traffic demand in that location. So you could try to anticipate that as well. But we just did it very simply. I was working with a city planning student for this, and so I just didn't want to make them do too much mathematics, because it would confuse them. And so that kind of simple ratio is over 2. So that means that this investment of the motorist's time really is still worth it, because the value of those injuries and those lives is so high. Even though crashes are rare, right? Just 5 non-incapacitating injuries, 2 incapacitating injuries, no deaths at this intersection. But those 2 things, valued at $500,000 per non-incapacitating injury and $3.5 million for the incapacitating ones here in the United States. I think the value of life, according to the Indian government, is much lower because of the willingness to pay and the income levels in India, but so is the motorist delay. So you could end up with this same value or something higher in a different setting. There's lots of treatments, as you guys know. You could have gateway signage. You could narrow the curbs and the radii on the turns, so the cars kind of have to slow down to stay in their lanes. They don't have a nice wide sweep. You can add pedestrian hybrid beacons in the middle of a section of roadway. Those are not cheap. That's adding like a little signal in the middle of a roadway. But if somebody presses it, it stops the traffic in the middle of the roadway very gently, very short term. It's not a big cycle change. It's just in the middle. We have these in many places, probably 30 places here in the city of Austin, which really help those pedestrians, and they don't slow the traffic down like a regular signal would. That's just when the pedestrian calls it. So we often have it near a grocery store in a kind of a high density location where people are making that crossing a lot, but we don't want to install a full signal. So a very nice thing. It reduces crashes up by almost 30%, pedestrian crashes. So this is the modification factor from the Highway Safety Manual. You can look these up online. There's a huge repository of crash modification factors based on lots and lots of US examples. And so that's where these average crash modification factors come from. You can raise the crosswalk. That's not cheap, but it has a 36% reduction. So it really makes the motorist see that this is a pedestrian crossing. So when you raise that crosswalk, you can have flashing lights, and beacons and medians, raised medians. This is kind of inexpensive. I think it would be more than $7 per square foot. Sorry, I was thinking per linear foot. But yeah, depending on what you do, raising a median, and you can install barriers on top of the median. We had to do that actually in the center of that freeway. We had homeless people crossing a freeway because we don't have fences on the side of our freeways here in Texas. We have frontage roads. And so there's like 3 lanes of frontage road, which you can pretty easily cross. And then you can try to get to the median of the freeway by crossing like 3 lanes at high speed. And that's where they usually die. And especially since they are sick, they are not in great health, persons who are homeless and people who are drunk. And so we actually had to install barriers on top of those center medians to try to discourage them from trying to cross a freeway. So lots of options here. These are just examples of making a tighter radius for the drivers, raising a crosswalk, and of course, just simple signage, really important for India, very inexpensive, and I hope you guys are doing that. We can calm the traffic. This is usually at a neighborhood level to try to slow down. I have a speed hump in front of my house. I love it. It's not noisy. It really protects me when I walk my dog. It protects me when I leave my driveway. It protects me when I'm driving. There are deer in my neighborhood, and that makes me slow down, which gives me extra time to see the deer or to see pedestrians and things like that. So traffic circles, road diets, we do all of this here in the United States. And so these are US costs, but they do have, 20 to maybe 40% reductions in pedestrian crashes by lowering those speeds and making the crashes less severe. So not only fewer crashes because the cars can stop in time because of the lower speeds, but much less severe. We extend, so in this case, we didn't really reduce the length of the crosswalk. This is an aerial view of I think 6th Street and that I-35 frontage road, but we extended the bulb here to kind of slow these vehicles from turning left because they were turning too fast. They were cutting this corner, and so we stopped them from doing that. I guess this is one way to do it is to slow those left turn vehicles down, and that can really help. You can add street lights. You can add lighting into the pavement. That's not cheap. I don't see that very often, but maybe in a very popular downtown that might be worth it. The pedestrian leading intervals we talked about. There's underpasses; those are expensive. I'm not sure what. Oh, an overpass is $206,000, and most pedestrians do not want to go up. They don't mind going down, even if it's the same amount of effort overall. It's just they're sort of like sheep. They just kind of would rather go downhill, and then they pay the price later of going uphill on the other side. And they don't have to go as far downhill as they would to overpass a truck crossing. So lots of options, lots of things. We have a report coming out, and I can point you to the draft report, but we have a formal report coming out on this. We also have been adding these bollards. These you can hit with a vehicle, but I don't think you'd want to cross it on a two-wheeler or a three-wheeler so they don't want you crossing this, but if you have to, you could, especially in a car. This wouldn't really hurt your car, but it really could hurt a moped user, as you would see in India. And so we've added those to kind of formalize the median. Even if there is no raised median here, there might be a little curb here, it looks like, but we've narrowed these turns, these right turns and left turns, and we're forcing the drivers to behave by adding these. They're kind of ugly. They don't look yellow for very long. They start to turn gray and black. They have black marks on them from trucks hitting them and things like that, but they're very effective if you need them. So if you don't mind ugliness, if your city is already ugly because of all the pavement and the vehicles, then these really aren't going to make it much uglier. We also recommend street furniture. It reminds the driver that there are pedestrians in the vicinity, and so it might be trees, it might be benches and bus stops, but it really reminds the drivers that there are pedestrians nearby, and it also gives them a visual cue for their speed. So if there's nothing to see, it's sort of like you're in an airplane. You can be going 400, 600 kilometers per hour, and you don't notice it because your eye doesn't see anything flashing by. So these raised pieces of furniture help. And then, of course, sidewalks are very valuable. This is a really nice sidewalk. I wish I had a sidewalk like this. It has a planting strip, which protects me from the vehicles. It also gives me some shade once those trees get a little bit more mature. But we do have neighborhoods, sometimes with this, not so much in Texas, but in like California and Massachusetts and more established communities. They made the investment in those kinds of sidewalks. And big crash reduction values. So this is like 80, a 75% or 86% crash reduction value by adding these trails and these sidewalks. So there's really dramatic reductions in pedestrian crashes when you give them their own road, basically. Signage is very cheap and can do a lot. Just this has a big crash reduction factor with very little cost. This was that median that we had to add to the middle of the freeway. This is not the freeway, but it was just an example on the side of the freeway. We have a good picture of it. And of course, it's great to add these medians where the pedestrians are likely to be, but drop the median for that crosswalk so that the pedestrian can stay almost at grade and there's no big bump to step up on, which can trip a pedestrian. So we've calculated benefit cost ratios for all sorts of things in all sorts of locations in some of our most dangerous places in Texas. And those little signs have benefit cost ratios over 1,000. So, this is a no-brainer. This has to be done. Even the refuge islands, in some locations, almost, hundreds of dollars of benefit for every dollar invested. And yeah, if you lower the traveler delay, you can also, if you're not delaying the motorist very much, then you can get very high benefit cost ratios. Here's that hybrid beacon just for the pedestrians. It's not a regular intersection. Leading interval where you start the walk signal before you start the drive signal by a couple seconds. And of course, you can stop right turns on red when there's lots of pedestrians for school, things like that. These are some other example benefit cost ratios where we had a student looking at these prohibitions, which, delayed some of the vehicles. So these beacons and these kinds of things delay the vehicles so they don't get as high a benefit cost ratio, but they really help give the street back a bit to the pedestrian. We've been really favoring the motorists here in the United States and many countries. And speed reductions, so a 10% reduction in the speed limit you might see an average 3% reduction in speeds of the motorists. So they're not going to follow the speed limit. They basically drive what they feel is safe, but this posted speed limit is helpful, but it's not the end all and be all. And this is like an example of a road diet where you have a 4-lane road and you make it like a 3-lane road, and you widen maybe the parking or the bike lanes get wider, and you add like an extra line to protect those bicyclists. In India, this might be both pedestrians and bicyclists, let's say. And there's also education, and I think that's really important for the U.S. And I think for India, is just reminding young people and old people about the value of life and the behaviors that we expect, and who has the right of way. As soon as a pedestrian sets her foot into that crosswalk, she has the right of way. And a lot of motorists don't know that here, and this is something you just have to continue doing. I do think vehicle design is a real problem. We're killing people with these heavy vehicles. Even if we're going slowly, we're really, really injuring them. And I think we should have auto braking required on all vehicles. It is really unethical to not have this in the United States. We have the money, and that auto brake function should be required. So I think Ford and Toyota and of course Tesla have it on almost all vehicles, but GM does not. And the European Union does much better. It has special protections on its bumpers and hoods. It charges a lot more for gasoline, which means the vehicles are a lot smaller, and they have much higher registration fees for bigger engines, which means the vehicles are a lot smaller. But in addition to that, they have some special tests, and they rate the vehicles before they sell them. The buyers know how high or how poorly the vehicle is rating and protecting the pedestrians. So I think we should do a lot more here in the U.S., a wealthy country where our vehicles are monsters. But we still don't really know why we have such high changes in those pedestrian deaths over time. I don't know if drivers are being, kind of cruel. I know under the Trump presidency, we had a lot worse behavior in some settings. So like school boards and people a lot more willing to argue about dumb things than we had before. So they might be a little more aggressive because of that. But this was happening during the Obama presidency as well, this rise. So I'm really not sure what's causing it. But it is easy to find the hot spots, and I think you guys can all do this, but I do think schools and transit stations, even after you control for walk miles traveled and jobs and population density, I think those are still going to be places where you have problems. Of course, if you have alcohol or drugs being sold someplace, those are probably also going to be places of higher crash incidents for all types of crashes, not just pedestrians. And I really hope that you will avoid this light duty truck love affair that Americans have. I think having high gas prices relative to incomes and registration fees that favor the smaller vehicles will really help you there. And of course, just watch out for aging. It's much easier to die if you're 60 years old or 70 years old than if you're 20 or 30. But of course, that's not something you can change. Just try to stay fit and alert. Also carry a light when you are walking. Definitely carry a light and make sure that the motorist can see that as the sun starts to go down. Very, very important. And hopefully you're all comfortable using benefit cost ratios and hopefully lobbying for new policies on education of motorists and pedestrians. I'd love to see speed governors on our vehicles. I don't think our vehicles should be able to go more than 120 kilometers per hour. I just think that's crazy. And with these smart vehicles, you can actually govern them for every link that you're on. So if the speed limit is 60 on one link, you shouldn't be able to go more than 70 or 80. Your vehicle should just naturally govern your speed choice and set a maximum. I also think our cell phones should be publicly reporting the gross violations that are happening all the time, and to teach those drivers that they can't get away with it. So I'd love to hear more from you now, if there's time, and I'll shut down these slides so I can see you better. But thanks so much for your patience. And I see some questions in the chat box if you'd like me to try to tackle that. And somebody asked about the Poisson distribution instead of a negative binomial. I can tell you that the Poisson is not as flexible. So it is a special case of the negative binomial. And I sometimes see the Poisson being preferred when we do vehicle ownership count models, but only in that case. It has never been preferred in a crash count case because it offers another degree of flexibility, allows over dispersion. If you have under dispersion, that's a possibility. There's lots of people that use hurdle models too because of the high zero counts. A lot of links have no crashes, so you sometimes see that. And what is the cause for homeless? It's they are mentally not fit to walk safely, so they are crossing into the traffic purposefully. It's like a suicide, basically. And it's not because they want to die necessarily, but they really don't have much to live for, and they don't care. And so you will see them moving. They also live oftentimes by the roadway, so they can accidentally, casually fall into the street and this kind of thing. Let's see, what's the best statistical approach to analyze pedestrian crash data? Well, I think for counts, you're going to want to probably use a negative binomial to start out with. And then for injury severity, you'll probably want to use like an ordered probit. An ordered logit is fine, but it uses a Gumbel error term, which most people aren't familiar with. So I like the normal error term of a probit. And then if you have time and ability, I would also compare those results to a random forest, which is a machine learning tool. AADT data is used here. That's the annual daily traffic number. So it's like vehicles per day. Is there any special considerations for the time, like the time of year when those traffic levels are exceeded? That's a great question. Because crashes are so rare, we aren't in this data set controlling for the day. There'd be a lot more zeros, as you can imagine, if we were using day-by-day data. But Friday nights and Saturday nights, which is early Saturday morning and early Sunday morning, those are very, very high crash dates because of the partying that goes on, the sort of staying out late and often drinking and just being casual and walking, and thinking nobody's out there. So you see a lot more pedestrians at those times of day. They're not sleeping and getting ready for the workday. What are the variables to consider in the measurement of accessibility of a walkway? So I do a lot of accessibility work, but not at a very local level. I do think walkways, you want to reduce the slope. And like I said, if you can have it go down first, that draws people that way. But of course, people, so going downhill is easier to get people to do first, and then they have to come up. And width, of course. I think painting on the ground is really valuable. Painting, direction, we expect you to stay on the right, and signage, slow people stay on the right, and little bump outs for people to stop and get out of the way. If you have very high traffic volumes of pedestrians, that might be helpful. What types of designs are used to capture data for the treatment effects? So that's a great question, because a lot of people put these treatments where there's a high crash rate. And so the next year they'll probably see a low crash rate just because of randomness, and I'll think, oh, great, the treatment worked. So usually they use empirical bays to try to reflect the fact that there is that treatment effect. But yeah, they don't put these treatments everywhere. It's too expensive. So you're absolutely right that there's a bias on that. Electric vehicles are getting popular and they're kind of quiet. I drive a Tesla and a Prius, although my son just crashed the Prius for us. We are not letting him drive the Tesla. And everybody can hear me, except when I'm coming out of a parking spot. And I think the US is making a lot of these manufacturers add some noise, some purposeful noise, which is very inexpensive to do to help with the backup while they're, even the Prius. I once scared my neighbors with the Prius. So luckily we all are required to have backup cameras. So people are using those, which helps a bit. A lot of people suggest 3D stickers. Oh, 3D stickers, that's neat. So on the ground to make them think that there's a pothole or there's a bump maybe. I think there are ways to draw lines on the road to show people how fast they're going and make the lines converge, and they think they're going too fast. They're going faster, so they start to slow down in very dangerous settings. You could try that. What software is used? I would recommend Python typically, but we also use R for the machine learning, and you can use find negative binomial and all those tools in both of those freewares. Conditions of heteroscedasticity need to be checked before these are used? No, usually it's just the statistical significance and the coefficients that will tell you that, yeah, the heteroscedastic model beats the homoscedastic model. But yeah, it's a little tricky to test like a machine learning model. So you have to have a holdout sample of about 20% of your data and randomize that to make sure you're not overfitting with a machine model. And if we could talk once more about street furniture and sidewalks. So sidewalks, as you can imagine, are the number one treatment. Get those pedestrians off to the side and above the traffic. So it might just be 6 inches, or 10 centimeters or something, but they are above, and the drivers are going to avoid that curb because that's dangerous. So if you can get the sidewalks in, that's a great improvement. If you can put a buffer there, like have parked cars or trees, and then have the pedestrians behind that buffer, that's even better, but that's expensive. So I think if you already have a busy place, adding some furniture that helps the driver recognize that there are pedestrians present. It might just be a sign, pedestrians present. These kinds of things remind the driver who's not really thinking. It's a very kind of casual process in the brain that's going on that just reminds the driver that, there could be pedestrians here, rather than just a post for a bus stop. Having something more formal is really helpful. Just pictures of pedestrians, stick figures, surprisingly helpful. Any other questions for me? I'm just looking at the chat box here.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for addressing the queries of the participants. So now I would request Professor Krishna to formally provide vote of thanks to our expert speaker.
Thank you, Savik. Thank you, Professor. You very excellent talk with a lot of research and a lot of statistics. Very nice. And I have not seen road safety analysis to this level earlier. I want to put one question to you before formally. Even BCRs you have shown for everything, there are BCRs coming. Then if these BCRs are coming like that, why the pedestrian deaths are not coming down?
I can't tell you. I know that the vehicles are getting bigger. And I know that people feel more safe in their vehicles because the vehicles are bigger, but they're also better designed. So and they're also quieter. So people don't notice. We also have more tinting of windows and things like that. And so all these things are cutting down on drivers' recognition of the situation that they're in and their own perceptions of their safety. So they're really ignoring the fact that there's probably a pedestrian or a cyclist could suddenly emerge because they're really looking for other vehicles that could hurt them. They're trying to protect themselves. They're not driving to protect others. They're trying to avoid their own personal losses, and they feel so safe in these really protective vehicles. It's really hard to die once you're belted in a U.S. vehicle. It's very difficult to die, and so they are, I think, going faster. I think maybe 80% of people exceed the speed limit here in the United States because they do feel safer than they used to 20 years ago. So speed is probably a big feature. We actually lost more people during COVID due to crashes because there was less traffic. And so people went faster and they ended up killing more people, even though there were fewer people on the roadways during COVID. So really, really sad story.
Okay. And do you have any data on driverless cars?
Yes, I have a paper at my website. So you can just Google my last name or use the URL I put in the chat box earlier. And I have a whole paper. It's a chapter basically of a book about, and it was presented at the Transportation Research Board conference. So I hope you guys will join us at the BTR conference. That is free. Bridgingtransport.org is the website for submitting, free. We won't share your paper with anybody, but you will get 30 minutes to present your paper in August if you pass the review process. But oh my goodness, I just lost my train of thought. What was I about to tell you? Oh, autonomous vehicles. So we do a ton of autonomous vehicle simulations. That's what I usually present about. And I have presented, I think, to IIT Kharagpur on that topic. But we expect about an 80% reduction in crashes from those vehicles. So they can't avoid all crashes. They can make crashes less severe. So they see things faster and they react faster. But, you know, we could have people driving very badly around them because if they are too cautious, people might try to zip in front of them or tailgate them. And pedestrians might think, oh, it's an autonomous vehicle, I think, and I'm just going to walk in front of it and expect it to stop. So there are ways, but I do think with the cameras on the vehicle, they can report the bad pedestrians, they can report the bad motorists. And so I really think we should be using our phones and our cameras. We have cameras on our vehicles, many of us, to start reporting those really bad violators and use the police can use facial recognition, they can use license plates to start targeting those people and getting them off the streets. You know, if they have to take away the license and the vehicle, they can do that. I'm just surprised we're not doing it already. I think New York City just started a program where you get $84 if you can get an idling vehicle, a truck, for 3 minutes, because the trucks are not allowed to idle more than 3 minutes in New York City now. And we should all have that kind of a program in our cities.
Nice. I want to tell you one funny rule in India. You know, I worked in the industrial city for 35 years and came to Hyderabad to settle. Hyderabad is a very big city. It's about,
Yes.
and their roads are also good roads. My friend told me one rule you should understand because you come new to Hyderabad. Here on the roads, pedestrian is right always. Pedestrian is always right. Whenever he wants to cross, he can cross. If anything happens to the pedestrian, you will be killed on the road. The car people will be hit. Car will be smashed by the people. Nothing will be told to the pedestrian.
So that's in
And-
Hyderabad. Wow. Yeah. That's unfortunately we don't have that kind of public support here. But you have so many pedestrians and so many eyes on the street. Here, a lot of times, the pedestrian's the only pedestrian, and it's just motorists who are watching the road, so they're not really seeing the details of the crime.
And I have hardly seen pedestrian deaths increasing in Hyderabad because of this rule.
Right.
Anyhow, this is on the lighter side. Professor Kokelman, your analysis, your work, I appreciate from my bottom of my heart. We are very happy. We are very, very happy with your speech. So I request all my participants, my students, you are given a speech which would be useful to practitioners as well as the academicians. So normally academicians talk we see, it is more inclined to academicians. But you are given a talk useful to practitioners also. A lot of practitioners are there in this audience and lot will be seeing your video in the YouTube. So you have given total justification to your talk. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And our CoE will be looking, working with you for in the traffic road safety is one of our key vertical also. So in the industries also road safety issues are there. That is also one of our important lot of work we have done. So thank you. And I thank the moderators for moderating the whole session very well. And the participants, I could see finally 100 participants joining. And thank you participants for your joining and putting good questions in the chat box. And I see some professors also join. So thank you, professors, for joining this session. Professor Maiti, you want to say anything?
Yes, Professor Kokelman, we are eagerly waiting for working with you in future, and it's really wonderful talk. Particularly the later part was so fantastic to us because real life, that real applications, and we used to do mathematical or statistical modeling here also using all those generalized linear model concept like negative binomial regression or Poisson regression, but linking the statistical that the findings to the real application and designing the interventions, that is fantastic, Professor. So we are so thankful to you. Thank you.
My pleasure. And of course, people like Natalia Zuniga and Ken Perrine and these others that I work with that have really done the hard work. So they're the ones pulling together those massive GIS databases and running the programs. So there's no way I could do any of this without that team of wonderful postdocs and researchers and students and undergraduate students too. So really very fortunate.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. All the participants, the session is over. Thank you very much. We'll meet again next Saturday, 8 p.m. as usual, with the industry speaker this time.
Next, please, next Friday.
Next Friday, yeah. Next Friday, 8 p.m.
Right.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, madam.
Bye. Get some sleep.
Okay. Yes.
Want to say anything, ma'am?
Oh, I'm going to go get some work done. You guys take care. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Right.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.